I'm not going to be showing you how you can make the scenes more efficient with your clones. And what we're going to be doing is basically cutting out anything that isn't within the camera view. So I've picked what's going to be a stationary camera and gone ahead and set that up. I've made a few changes to the materials within the scene, the rocks and the landscape. The current version of the scene is number 8 rocks-2 with the clone placements. The textures may probably won't be as high res as what I'm working with, which is going to be provided with the training just because of file size limitations. Some of these files alone are rather large and would be a huge content file. I do want to make a few notes about what I did with the landscape, and mainly the material for the grass. What I did was set up diffusion with a fall off. So by using fall off, it kind of creates a faked ambient occlusion. So what I was able to do is kind of darken some of the areas that would have normally be darkened by ambient occlusion, but instead using fall off just to process that much quicker. I also want to make a note that anytime you use the fall off for a material, if you were to apply the material to multiple objects, it will create a duplicate material because the fall off it does take into account the shape of the object. So every object you assign it to, it's going to need to be calculated for the fall off. So it will end up creating duplicates of that material if you're using the fall off. If we take a look at the render, there's really only a very small section of rocks showing from the original overall setup for the clones. If I get out of the camera view and we take a look at the scene, we have rocks showing up pretty much all over the place. And now camera 2, which is going to be the final camera, is right here. I'm going to go ahead and just hide the other ones. It looks like I'm waiting for it to refresh. Okay, so now we can see just the final camera and what's going to be showing up. So we only have this small little portion in the center that is really going to be showing. So the rest of these clones are not needed. So what we want to do is set up some subtractions for not only the rocks, but also all of the trees, because it's just going to take more resources than are needed. So the best thing to do, at least with a stationary camera, if you have camera motion, then you need to broaden your range a little bit more. I'm going to switch over to switch my display, and so I can see the entire terrain and scene layout. And what I want to do is, there's a couple of ways you could set this up. I'm better with Photoshop, so I'm just going to be working in Photoshop for this. But if you are familiar with body paint, you'd be able to also achieve this within body paint, creating a texture. So what we want to do is create a texture for the terrain to just be a flat, or basically just using the UV, and have one tile over the entire terrain, black and white, basically an alpha that's going to cut everything out that we don't need. So you can either create a new texture and use body paint to paint in where you want the objects left, but what I'm going to do is just hit print screen and then go into Photoshop, and I've already set this up so it does look a little bit different because I'm showing weights on the rocks. So if you did want to be able to see some of the objects a little bit better, what you can do is go to rocks, bring up the attributes, and under Transform, change the display so you can show the objects. And you could choose to show the UV or the color, whatever's going to make it easier for you to kind of pick out what it is that you need. So what I ended up doing was creating 2 separate maps, one for the rocks, and since we have a large hill and everything behind it isn't seen, I chose to just keep what's directly in front of the camera and around that bit of water. And then the vegetation is going to extend to the all the way through the scene. And I also have it slightly outside the camera bound, and that's going to look a little bit better with shadows, to be able to have some objects on the outside, and it gives you a little leeway, so you don't have just this huge cut, and you can really extend a little bit further if needed, depending on the scene. So how I just made that was I created a new layer. I just painted in a flat color of black, or actually, well, we can just invert it. It doesn't really matter which colors you start with. I'm going to go over to white for the color. I just use the rectangle shape tool and just draw out the shape, rasterize it, and then Control T for free transform, and I just lined that up with the extent, or the camera edge. And I do have the other camera showing in this version. Just drag it a little bit outside the bounds, and then holding down Alt and Shift and using the Move tool, which is V on the keyboard, you can create a duplicate, then Control T to free transform, and I just went ahead and fit that in, and then turned on that background. Selected all the layers, Control E to merge them together. Then we can invert it to get the correct alpha output. Created a duplicate of the layer, and then for the rocks, I just went in and using a hard brush, maybe something a little smaller, just kind of cutting out what was needed and painting that in. So for a smoother brush, we can go to the brush tip shape, change the spacing down to 1%. Really wish all the presets had that. I'm going to have to go through and change all of mine to have no spacing, since I typically like to work with a smoother brush. And then we can add in that other area. So then we basically have these alphas set up, so the rocks, and then also for the vegetation. So I just went ahead and named those layers and saved them out as a layered TIFF file. And I'm calling this a Mojection Layer. So basically a MoGraph projection, just to kind of separate it from everything. And that's kind of how I've been referring to it in my own scenes. It was originally designed for camera projection, but unfortunately it had too many incompatibilities, at least at the moment. Haven't yet found a good enough setup to be able to have a dynamic camera projection, at least from images. With the way the volume effector is set up to remove objects around the camera, a similar setup can be created to just keep the items in view, and then assigning that to the camera will move it with the camera, so that way it is a dynamic subtraction of everything. So we're going to go over now to the camera view, and then we're going to go to our materials, and I'm going to create a new material, calling this the rock cleanup, or rock position, rock placement. Actually, rock placement will probably work a little bit better. So then see if I have the layer in the scene. I just created a new layer called Mojections just to separate these materials from everything else. So I'm going to double click to open up the material editor for that and just load in that image. So Mojection Layers. I'm going to go ahead and choose the rock layer. And you could delete the background too. I wanted to keep it in just so I can go back, make any modifications, create new layers if needed. And now I'm going to copy this from the color and paste it onto the alpha. Turn off the color, turn off the soft mode, and invert. And what we can do is just drag this material onto the landscape. So it is going to cover everything up at the moment. We're just going to kind of keep that there for the moment, just for the sake of reference. Although, after the setup is complete, we can move it underneath the grass layer, which is the main landscape layer, which is going to just cover it up completely. And I'm going to take a look and see if that shader projector or effector is being used in the scene at all. I'm not sure if I added that in separately. It may not be assigned to anything at all at the moment. Okay, so I'm just going to delete that because it doesn't look like it's controlling anything. I was just setting it up in advance. So we add in from the MoGraph menu shader effector. And actually, it's a good idea to select the rocks first and then add it so it automatically adds it to the list. And I'm going to call this Mojection Rocks. And then turn off the scale. And depending on the setup for the rocks is going to be different because we don't have any animated effects on them. So this is probably one of the easiest setups. What we want to do is go back to the effectors menu, and we want to make Mojection the first item in the list. So this way we're subtracting everything and removing it before it even gets to the waterfall off, because otherwise that's going to overwrite and override the other settings, and just it may not work correctly. So now we can go to the shader, and under the shading menu, choose the alpha, and then drag in that texture tag for the rock placement. And it's already set up because it's the UVW map, and using it from the top view, everything's aligned correctly. We don't need to tile it, so it's fine. What we want to do for the main control is turn on visibility, which is going to cut everything out. And now we have just this section of rocks being created. And basically what we're doing is just limiting the area before we reach the other effectors. So with this setup, what we can also do is if we go to the camera view, if you decide to add or remove any additional rocks, you can just use body paint and paint directly on this texture to add or remove any areas of the rocks. And the way this setup is created, it won't remove any of the existing rocks or change the setup or the layout. So now what we can do is take the material tag from the end of the landscape and bring it to the front so that it's no longer going to be rendered. So if we take a look at the new rendered scene and the previous version before the setup, they are identical in the placement of the rocks. The only thing that looks like it's changing slightly is some of the lighting. And I think that's just because I have a bunch of filters in the render settings, median filter, color mapping filter, a couple of different changes there. Plus I'm not using the best anti-aliasing setting, so the results are going to be, or won't be exactly the same just because of the quality of my render. Other than that, exactly the same. So at this point, we do have the option to optimize the scene and remove everything affecting the rocks, all of the effectors and everything, by creating a MoGraph cache. Now, depending on the size of the amount of clones, how many clones you have, it will affect the amount of memory needed. So if we go to the attributes, pulling that up, go over to the object manager. I'm going to right-click on the rocks and go to our MoGraph tags and select the MoGraph cache. So what we can do is bake the cache. No further calculation is needed for the rocks anymore. So it's a good idea to save out another version of the scene once you've cached it, so that you can go back if you need to reset it up or make any modifications. And then at this point, what we can do is go through and delete anything that is manipulating the rocks, because we don't need to have any of those shaders in the scene anymore. Now, because I do intend to provide these scenes with the training, I am going to remove the cache and leave it open, because it'll keep the file size down. But anytime before you render, you're going to need to bake out the cache. And it's going to be really important, too, for any of our dependent type objects. In other words, our small trees are created around the larger trees, so we need to bake the cache for the large trees first, and then the small trees afterwards. Now, I also want to note that the reason we're using a shader effector is because we have a landscape object with no selectable polygons, and that's because it's not baked. So if and the reason I'm showing it like this is because you're not always going to be able to bake out the object, or you're not always going to want to. If you want to leave it open as a landscape object and not a baked or actual amount of polygons, then you can use the shaders to place it. Otherwise, you can just use a polygon selection tag as part of the original clone options. So we're on the landscape, and then if we have a selection set up for the landscape, we can just drag it into the selection. In the case of this scene, it would actually be very easy to either bake this terrain, or basically take the landscape, hit C on the keyboard to make it editable once we've defined the amount of width and depth segments we've finalized, and then just use that, which means we would be able to remove the displaced deformer, remove any of the displacement on the material, and then just have that finalized terrain, and then be able to select polygons. But what we can also do is create a duplicate terrain to use to control the clones separate from the rendered version. So that is also a possibility. And in that case, you can sometimes use a lower res version just to get the initial placement. The main problem is for very fine areas that cut off and drop off, things like that, you might have some polygon overlapping. Because of the way the objects are placed, if the pivot or the object axis point is positioned in a way, or basically we have everything kind of by the bottom with a little bit of leeway, there is a possibility of having objects being above the terrain or completely getting cut off if the object's too low that we're using for the controller. But that is also a possibility. So if you do want to have a separate rendered object from your placement object, in this case what we would have to do is go through all of the clones and change the object from the landscape that is currently used to a duplicate, which we would right-click and go to current state to object, because we do want to preserve the displaced deformation. Otherwise, it just won't match. Or, like I said, you can use that as the final object. So let's move on and take a look at setting up the vegetation. So we're going to create a new material, call it vegetation placement. Actually, what I'm going to do is just copy and paste the other one and rename the rock vegetation, because we already have the material set up. All we need to do is just change the image map. So we can go to the alpha and select the vegetation. And now we can drag the material onto the landscape. And we also need a new shader. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of our the plants, small trees, and large trees. And actually, I think now that I'm thinking about it, I don't think the small trees is going to need this shader setup, because it's being controlled by the large trees. So once the placement of those is set, they're not going to be showing up anywhere else. So we're just going to assign this to the large trees and the plants. So I'm going to add in shader effector, go to the attributes and turn off the scale modifier, and call this Mojection Veggie. And what we can do under shading is select alpha and then drag in that texture tag and turn off tiling. Other than that, it's basically set up. So what we need to do is adjust visibility, and we also need to keep in mind that we do have a different effector setup than we do on the rocks, and it might not be best to place this first in the list, and we're going to have to possibly rearrange some of the weighting, so we will have to see. So I'm going to move this tag down lower so that we don't see it, and we're just going to take a look now at the animation. So we're going to scrub through just a little bit so that we can pay attention to the objects. And we're going to go to that shader effector and turn on the visibility. Now we can see what it's done is filled in all of those large trees. And we may not even be seeing the animation. It does look like the animation is still, for the most part, working, but it has created a large modifier. If we go to the fall off and turn off the weight influence, go ahead and take a look. The main thing is we've lost the subtraction in a few of the areas based on the water. So it is not the way it was set up earlier. So what we'll need to do is go to the large trees to start, go to the effectors list, and now we need to figure out exactly how we're going to be setting up the mojection. So what I'm going to do is move this to the front of the list first, and we can take a look and see how that's turning out. I'm going to turn up that weight influence. For the most part, it's just not really working. So what we'll probably have to do is we might just need to use the shader to just affect the weight, but it's going to depend on the way the effector is currently working in order to get it set up correctly. So it does depend largely on the other effectors. So we're going to go over to the shader that is removing the large trees. And now this is affecting the weight at 100%, which means any modifications we make before this will be canceled out by the weight applied by this shader. So if we go to the list of our large trees, the removed large trees was first on the list. So any modifications we make to the weight before that shouldn't affect anything after. So if we select the new shader, what I'm going to choose to do is modify the weight, and then for the remove large trees shader that comes next, go to shading, or actually go to fall off, and turn the weight down to 0. So now this remove large trees shader is working within the defined weight area which we just set up with the image map shader. If needed, you might have to set the weights of both shaders to 50% in order to get more trees, but I think I am going to set those back to 0 for the remove large trees and 100 for the previous. So now if we scrub through, we should be able to see everything showing up correctly. And we have a nice limited area. I also have set up on the shader that we just set up the visibility. Now if I turn that off, we can see all of the additional clones behind it. So it's a good idea to keep that on. And the small trees that are just created, that's just a refresh error, because, well, not really an error, just because there were just clones there. So we can just turn it off, turn it back on. Go back into the main viewport, and everything looks good. We still don't have any intersections with any of the effectors, so those are showing up afterwards, and that's a good setup. So we can basically carry over the same setup to the plants, or the small setup going around the edge of the water. So go to the plants, and now remembering that this does change the weight, so depending on how the plants are placed within the scene, we may have to reconfigure or use a different shader reflector specifically for the plants, but it does look like that is working correct. They're very small, so it is harder to see them, but it doesn't look like there are any showing up outside the defined range. So that in fact worked quite to remove those areas. So we just modified the weight and used the visibility to cut everything out, and then that weight was able to control the next placement, or large controller, which then was overwritten, so then it didn't continue down the chain to throw off any of the animated effectors or anything we had previously set. So this also, this type of optimization is a great way to just kind of get things ready before you go ahead and switch these objects out with higher res objects, just to keep the scene a little more efficient.